Well, welcome. Today, we're hosting our first webinar related to City Nature Challenge, how to use iNaturalist to participate in the 2023 City Nature Challenge, which is great. We have 43 registered cities across the country this year. So thanks to all the city organizers who have put that hard work in to not only get everything registered, but then to join us with the City Nature Challenge Canada initiative, which is really designed just to amplify our efforts across the country and see if we can compete on a global scale in the middle of April against some pretty sunny cities. So hopefully this is helpful today. My name is David DeRocco. I'm the Senior Manager of Marketing and Events here at Canadian Wildlife Federation. My colleague James Paget will be leading this webinar today. James, do you want to move to the next slide, please? So this is a bit of some logistics. If any of you are having any issues right now, any audio or Zoom issues, let us know. Only myself and James will be able to see the chat posts. I'll be administering the webinar this afternoon. If you do have questions, put them in the Q&A. The slides, there's only one more. I don't think there's a slide presentation. If there is, we will make it available. So this is just a little bit of information about Canadian Wildlife Federation. So how many on the webinar today? Looks like we're up to about 93, just so you know. Welcome to all our partners. For those who don't know much about CWF, we have been around since 1962. We're a national conservation supporter-based charity. We conduct all our activity in a collaborative way, working with Indigenous and First Nation groups, government, local residents, partners, and we do that using the best science that we can find to support our efforts. CWF has 6 main pillars of activity that you see here, and these are where the majority of our science and education based projects are built from. We're located in Canada, Ontario. We've been administering the City Nature Challenge Canada now for 3 years. We started with 6, I think 3 years ago. We're up to 43, so it does speak to the efforts of the cities involved, but also the importance we all feel about tracking biodiversity and getting involved in the City Nature Challenge event. James, do you want to introduce yourself? There we are.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. That's great. Yeah, so as Dave mentioned, our office is in Canada, which is part of Ottawa, Ontario, and we are located then on the unceded territory of the traditional the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So with immense gratitude, I want to acknowledge that none of this would be possible as we're talking about biodiversity and conservation and appreciating nature, wouldn't be possible without the centuries of stewarding of the land of the people that were here originally. As Dave mentioned as well, this webinar will be recorded. So this one and others like this about iNaturalist and other CWF initiatives can be found online on our website. The best thing to do is Google CWF webinars, but I can also drop that in the chat probably as well. for people to follow a link to that. So this webinar and others about specifics on how to add observations to iNaturalists, how to identify certain species groups, kind of in a workshop type atmosphere, and how to deliver events like BioBlitzes to collect biodiversity information. All of those webinars can be found on CWF's page. If, as I mentioned, Google CWF webinars is probably the easiest way to find those. So I'm going to talk about the City Nature Challenge and how it all began and where it is today and how people can contribute. So the City Nature Challenge originated in 2016, the first ever Citizen Science Day, also now termed or also known as Community Science. So teams at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, they challenged the California Academy of Sciences based in San Francisco to a friendly competition to see who could collect the most observations of nature, primarily using the iNaturalist app. So this was kind of a fun thing they did back in 2016. Other cities got wind of it and thought it was a pretty cool idea. So it went national in 2017 around the US, and then went international around the world a year later in 2018. So different cities from around the world were picking up on this and trying to join the same kind of challenge, all against in a friendly competition against each other for the biodiversity crown, so to speak. So then 2019, it first appeared in Canada with 3 cities, Richmond, BC, Calgary, as well as Halifax took part. Then, as Dave mentioned, CWF got involved around in 2021 to help, as he said, boost Canadian participation, but also to bring the cities together on kind of under one umbrella to kind of help encourage participation, but as a friendly competition as well amongst each other. Those 3 initial organizers are still going strong, doing it again this year with CWF managing the Canada-wide initiative. So yeah, it wouldn't be at all possible without all the hard work of the local organizers and events coordinators there they're doing an amazing job across the country. So one of the reasons, as Dave mentioned, was to kind of, so to speak, level the playing field. We are slightly latitudinally challenged with our cold climate in April, but we're looking to compete within our own country as well as kind of contribute to this kind of global biodiversity initiative. There are 43 cities taking part this year against or amongst over 460 around the world. And at its core, basically, is to see who can gather the most wildlife observations, record the most species, and attract the most participants. But it's all in like a unified goal to track biodiversity worldwide. And all of this over the span of just 4 days. So this is why I personally, I think it's probably the largest kind of community science initiative within a short time span around the world, with this many people taking part all at the same time across the same 4 days around the whole world. All the observations that are recorded during the City Nature Challenge are especially in Canada, some are using other platforms, but the vast majority are going into iNaturalist, which is probably the most comprehensive database of kind of diverse species occurrences in Canada and around the world. And I'll talk about how that data contributes to iNaturalist from the City Nature Challenge. There are roughly 20 countries around the world that have their own version of iNaturalist, like we do here in Canada. And that database is a vast resource of biodiversity information that is publicly available, but also shared for research and conservation purposes as well. We have close to 10 million observations in Canada, and we're hoping that we're going to be able to hit that 10 million mark during the City Nature Challenge. It's quite likely, given the numbers that we can put up. But there are also 130 million around the world that contribute to this kind of global database. In Canada, it's bilingual in French and English, as well as all our resources are for the City Nature Challenge, but also resources for iNaturalist. And as I mentioned, the data can be shared for conservation purposes. So what's been accomplished? So just looking at last year in the City Nature Challenge, there were 446 cities taking part. Collectively, we posted nearly 1.7 million observations around the world in just 4 days. The very first few City Nature Challenges actually broke iNaturalist in a way. They weren't expecting the volume of observations, and they're much more prepared for it this year. So it's a huge influx of biodiversity data. It engaged 67,000 people around the world, and our Canadian contributions were also significant. We had almost 77,000 observations, 4,000-ish people that have contributed. Many others actually attended events, but maybe didn't contribute observations as well. And remember that this is in April in Canada, so some cities were still and may still be under snow again this year. So all of that kind of combating with our northern climate, I think is a pretty good showing. The top 5 species we can see from last year, probably not all that surprising. So maybe people are wondering, what's the value? Why bother having, reports of all these everyday species? We know Canada has lots of geese and ducks and robins. So why is all this information all that valuable? Well, for one, as I showed the map of that heat coverage, which is those orange squares across the globe that show kind of where the density of observations are. Just sheerly with that many observations, we can glean patterns of biodiversity. So we can see patterns of return from migration. For example, looking at the iNaturalist data in general, red-winged blackbirds seem to have shown up a little bit earlier this year than they have in past years. So just looking at the data that's available, we can use that for biodiversity research and conservation work. And we never know when something, that was once extremely common, like our little brown bats in Canada, the barn swallows, American bumblebees, when they may suddenly be in decline. So having this kind of baseline of where species are found across the country and all around the landscape is extremely important. Hindsight is 2020 when we look back and we're like, oh, it would have been good to know where some of these species were before they started declining. Well, hindsight is blind if we don't have this baseline information, this data of where species occurred. Also, all of the observations of the City Nature Challenge as feed into iNaturalist, which also is being used for conservation work, like defining key biodiversity areas, which are slated for conservation in Canada. That helps track invasive species and provides information on endangered species in Canada. So as an example, for endangered species, there's a group of experts called the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, whose job is to determine which species are at risk of extinction in the country. They then they undertake an assessment on species across the country. They provide that assessment to the federal government to propose for being added to the federal official species at risk list. And they're more and more relying on iNaturalist data for their assessments. So looking at their list, comparing with some of the observations that were taken during the period of the City Nature Challenge just last year, there's over 1,000 observations of species at risk of extinction in Canada that were observed during the time period of the City Nature Challenge. Not all of these were in the City Nature Challenge specifically, it's just the same time period. So it's going to come back to when I talk about how to participate. It's important, even if your city isn't participating, we can still contribute to conservation across the country during and all year round, during the CNC and all year round as well. But if you do remember some of the cities on the map, there's a lot in the Toronto area, the East Coast, Vancouver, Calgary. So we definitely do see some observations that were recorded that did contribute as well to the City Nature Challenge. You can see on the species list on the right-hand side, these are the kind of most observed species that are species at risk in Canada. So we can kind of see some of the contributions that people have made during the City Nature Challenge to understanding those species. A couple of noteworthy ones as well. One in particular actually is the Western chorus frog on the bottom left there. This species only calls for about 3 weeks in parts of Ontario and Quebec. And it just so happens to coincide and overlap with the 4 days of the City Nature Challenge. So we're able to get some information on the species at a time when people are out taking part in the City Nature Challenge to help contribute to that initiative as well. So how to participate? These are the cities that are taking part, and I'm going to put this slide up again at the end. So if you don't memorize every single city, totally understandable. So the first thing to do is figure out if you are in one of these cities. There's a map at cedarnaturechallenge.ca that will also show these locations, so you can head there. An easy website to remember. And if you aren't quite in one of these cities and you're really dedicated, you can consider a road trip. But if that's not in the cards for you, totally understandable, no problem. So you can still contribute to iNaturalist, as I mentioned, during the City Nature Challenge and all year round, and contribute observations from there, not just within a participating city. But there's also a way to get involved, even if you're not within one of those cities, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Okay, so to take part, as I mentioned, iNaturalist a couple of times. I'm going to talk about how that works a little bit for those that maybe aren't as familiar with iNaturalist. You can head to iNaturalist.ca or download the iNaturalist app. Both are free, and you can create an iNaturalist account. Once you have an account, whether you sign into the app or the website, they talk back and forth. So anything you add from one will automatically go to the other and vice versa. So both are interchangeable. And then to take part in the City Nature Challenge, so from April 28th to May 1st is the observation period. Basically take photos and sound recordings of wild plants and animals. You can upload them to the app using your smartphone, or directly if you're using a digital camera or a smartphone, and add them to the website at iNaturalist.ca. Simple as that. That's basically all you need to do to be able to contribute. If you're in a city, take a photo or sound recording, add it to iNaturalist. It automatically gets added to the City Nature Challenge total for your city, for the National City Nature Challenge in Canada, and the global initiative as well. So one photo, one upload adds it to all of those at once. So specifically to use iNaturalist, we have a webinar that's an hour long just on the nuances of adding observations in iNaturalist. So I'm not going to get into all of that, but kind of a quick overview. And a real take home is that you do not need to be an expert to use iNaturalist. You don't even have to know what it is you're taking a picture of. If you can take a photo of something, you can of wildlife, plants, animals, lichens, anything living under the sun, you can contribute to conservation. That's the bottom line. To do that, there is a simple to use app that accesses your camera, allows you to take a photo, automatically records the date and time of from your device, and allows you to add extra information like whether add some notes on your observation, and mark whether it's captive or cultivated. And that's important as well. If your species that you're taking a photo of is, say, a garden plant, we want to make sure you check that so that people know that that's not a wild species, to add to the kind of more in-depth data that we can get out of iNaturalist, because we're really trying to focus specifically on wild species. As I mentioned, it does pull the location off your device, but you're going to want to keep an eye on the accuracy that's down on the right side of the screen, which would kind of gets a fix on exactly where your location is. If you click save a little too quick and your accuracy is still kind of honing in on your location, you're like several hundred meters or kilometers, then that's not as useful to conservation. It's harder to be able to use that information if we don't know exactly where you were. An accuracy of a couple hundred kilometers means that you could be anywhere within that radius to take that observation. So that's something to bear in mind. Give it a second. Most smartphones can get between 10 and 20 meter accuracy depending on where you are. So keep an eye on that. Also, if you're adding photos that you already have saved on your device, like a photo you take with your phone and then you open the app and add that, it won't show an accuracy at all. And that's really important, and we need to know that there is some kind of accuracy to know exactly where you were taking that observation from. Similarly, the website allows you to, you log into your account and you'll see an upload button on the top right. Once you click that, it allows you to drag and drop photos to add an observation. Same way you move files around on your computer. Again, if the photo was taken with a GPS-enabled device like a smartphone, it will automatically add the location and the date time would also be added. But again, like adding a photo to the app, instead of taking a photo, the accuracy won't show up. So what you want to do is click on this pin, this field that tells you the location. It's going to bring up a map. You can either click on the map that will give you a kind of a set accuracy between, like, that's relative to the zoom, the scale of the map, or you can write it in down here in the bar itself. You click update and it adds your accuracy to your observation. Now, both in the app and online, there's the image recognition software that's built in, which provides suggestions on what that species is. And it's really good, but it's not perfect. So definitely want to make use your judgment, looking at the photos. If you're not certain, just add something general. Adding an identification like flower or lichen is perfectly acceptable. There's a community of hundreds of thousands of people that can help identify that observation. Also, to remember, the better your photo is, then the more easily people and the image recognition software can actually get a better photo, get a better identification on that photo and on that observation. Once you click save, it is added to your personal list of observations. This is mine from the Ottawa area, but that also gets added automatically, as I said, to the City Nature Challenge observations. These are the observations from last year in the Ottawa-Gatineau area of the City Nature Challenge. And it's all becomes part of the Canadian and global iNaturalist database. Now, if during the City Nature Challenge, you happen to have a backlog of uploading photos, if you have a whole bunch on your phone or camera that you haven't uploaded, and you're midnight on May 1st, frantically trying to get them in because everybody's going to be up until midnight, right? Super keen to add these in. Don't stress, it's okay. We actually have until May 7th to upload photos, but they have to be observations and photos and sounds that were taken during those first 4 days. So up until May 1st only, but we still have them until the 7th to actually upload them to iNaturalist. So what are we looking to record? Animals for starters, of course, and be aware that sound recordings are very useful, especially for birds, not so much for plants. So you'll definitely need a photo. We can also take photos of bark of trees. This is a live tree, but it's leaf off time. So the image recognition software actually works quite well as well for barks, and certain things like this butternut are quite distinctive, and other people can identify a tree by the bark even if you can't. But also things that aren't living. This is an old Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot from last season. The remnants are there and it's still going to be identifiable from that. I didn't throw any pictures of roadkill up here for everybody's sake, but that's also a valid entry. So it works for dead or alive things. Also, evidence of what we saw. Moose poop is also a valid entry into iNaturalist. Obviously, there was a moose here at one point, so that's still something we can record. And depending on where you are, you may not have bear tracks that you're finding, but you'll definitely, you could come across deer or rabbit or squirrel tracks that also can be added to iNaturalist as part of the City Nature Challenge and in general to iNaturalist. As I mentioned, we're looking for wild observations. So that's basically anything that was put there intentionally by people is not considered a wild observation. So garden plants are pets, zoo animals, those are not wild. Things like a garden plant that has now escaped and become naturalized or growing on its own elsewhere, that is considered a wild observation or wild species, so that can be added. And if you do happen to add a species that is not wild, just make sure that's okay. We can still take those, but just make sure we check that box that says captive or cultivated. So in this example, this monarch visiting a coneflower, this was in a garden area. I should be probably cropping this to the monarch and cutting out the flower a little bit so that it really hones in on the monarch that we're looking to add the observation for. But as I said, it's still valuable to know that the monarch was visiting this coneflower. So it could be a valid observation, but I definitely would want to make sure that I note that that is a cultivated flower. So some ideas of how to record things and what we're looking at. You know, our smartphones can do a lot of amazing things, but capturing a bird in a far off spruce tree like this is not one of them. So for something like this, you definitely need the right tool for the right job. So a camera with a zoom is much more useful for a bird that's in the tree, but even the tree itself, a far off photo like that of the tree isn't as great as getting something where you can see the cone and the leaf, the needles as well. Taking multiple photos and multiple angles, like this mushroom, sometimes it's required to have different angles of a species. The underside of a mushroom is key as well. But we want to keep one observation to one individual though. So the tree that this is growing on should be a separate observation. So the elm tree that this is growing on is different from the mushroom itself. So we'd want to take a different photo of the elm tree itself and these ones of the mushrooms and add those as separate observations. But it is valuable to know what this species is growing on. You gotta capture the habitat, or like in this case, what it's growing on, because this is called an elm mushroom. So it would be very helpful to know that this is growing on an elm tree as other people are looking to identify it. So as a good example. And obviously capture what's the identifying features. And I'm gonna have a mention about what some of those are for certain species groups. But in general, anything that sets it apart or looks a little bit different from something else is key. So eye stripes on a bird, patterns on the back of a frog, the underside of a mushroom like this to see the gills. So anything kind of helps distinguish it or that looks a little bit different from other things. So where to look, where to go to take part. So we can look for one in and around our home. Outside, bird feeders are great options. Keep an eye on those during the City Nature Challenge. Inside our homes, not everybody wants to think about how many creepy crawlies might be living in our basement, but those are actually wild observations that are still valid to add to the City Nature Challenge. We can look around a city, even just on the street sides and parks. There's lots of lichens that grow on stone buildings, on stone walls, fence posts, even wood piles or brush that's lying or logs that are lying around underneath some of those as well. If we're going to be moving anything like logs or rocks to look underneath, make sure you do it extremely carefully and gently and set it back when you're done. Gently set it back to make sure that you maintain that habitat, that home for whatever it is you're looking at, and that you're not crushing anything in the meantime. If your city does have a green belt, your city's website would have a map of where these are and some walking paths most likely through it. But even any green space in the cities, there's often lots of access. In cities and more rural areas, a great place to look is just Google Maps. If you look at the imagery, I have never been to Edmonton, so I was curious if I could find spots to go just looking at the maps. So I was kind of keying in on some of these green spaces around the Saskatchewan River and figured probably there's some walking paths and bet there's a place to go in there. So as you zoom in, Google Maps does show some paths that I'm sure are publicly accessible to go and explore. Apologies if anybody's listening from Edmonton and I've got something completely wrong on that, but just wanted to show kind of some line of thinking you could use to go and see if you can find out, figure out some areas to go to add observations. And as you're adding observations, be mindful of your surroundings, both for wildlife, the habitat, and others. CWF has been working with Leave No Trace Canada for a couple of years now to promote responsible observing, but also responsible actions when in nature. So this is during the City Nature Challenge, but also all year round. And working with them, we've created a one-page handout. That's a PDF that can be downloaded both in French and English. That can be found in the resources section of iNaturalist, in the that you can get to from the help section, but also in the about section in iNaturalist. It can be downloaded to look at, to share, to send around to others as well as we're out exploring. So a couple of these ideas is to hang on, just lost it. Pardon me, it looks like my PowerPoint just closed down. Can you give me a second? That could be a good time.
I can still hear you, James, but
Yeah.
yeah.
My PowerPoint just closed down for whatever reason. If there are any questions, now might be a good time. We can answer a few questions in the meantime.
Yeah, I've got a few here that people have posed. Number one, are we connected to eBird?
Good question. We are not directly connected with eBird. I've spoken with folks at Birds Canada in general about the data access, but no, we're not directly affiliated with eBird. iNaturalist is set up for kind of general species observations, not as well set up for, eBird is definitely designed for birders and bird recording. iNaturalist is much more of a generalist, all observation kind of thing. So each has their valuable niche, their valuable contributions. But yeah, iNaturalist itself isn't directly related to eBird.
Okay. Are there preferred image sizes for uploading?
Not necessarily preferred image size. In general, getting a close in focus image that shows the characteristics is what we're aiming for here. But the sizing, not necessarily. If you set your account to allow access to, like in your licensing, the Creative Commons license, it actually is easier to store. The file storage takes up a lot of space for iNaturalist in general, and they're storing. So if you go to your licensing and allow it to be a Creative Commons, so it makes it more of an open license, iNaturalist can freely store that through a third party. So it actually makes it easier for them to store their photos.
Okay. Is City Nature Challenge configured to omit observations of captive specimens?
No, so as I was saying, like we prefer not to have captive and cultivated, but it isn't set to omit them. So if you do take things that are considered captive or cultivated, they still count. Yeah. So just make sure you note them as such.
So if you're walking through a city park, say you're leading a guided tour, how do you know what's cultivated and what's not? What's the determining factor?
Good question. That's where we suggest, if it looks like it was planted there intentionally, then it would be considered captive or cultivated, including city trees, right? If there's city sidewalk trees that obviously have been planted as part of the cityscape, then that would be considered cultivated. It's not obvious every time, so you have to use your judgment a little bit, but anything that looks like it was intentionally put there, like trees in an arboretum, or something that looks like it's in a garden bed or a planter, then that would be considered cultivated.
Okay. Are there plans to allow video in the future on iNaturalist?
I don't know the answer to that. That would be a question for the kind of the creators at iNaturalist.org that it all feeds into. My guess would be not so much, just because of the space that a video file would take up. It'd be a bit taxing on the system.
Okay, can you clarify geo-privacy? What did you mean by that?
Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that when I was talking about adding observations. Yes, geo-privacy is basically how others will see your observation on a map when you add it. So there's two kinds of geo-privacy. There is automatic, it's called taxon geo-privacy, but it's basically a list of 200 species or so that are at risk if their location is known. There's certain turtles that are at risk of poaching and collection. There's certain plants that may be dug up for medicinal use. Those are automatically obscured in iNaturalist. So that's a geo-privacy in that sense, basically meaning that it's the true location is a random spot within a box of about 15 by 20 kilometers. Then there's the geo-privacy people can set at the time of making an observation, which is a little box you can check, or you can tap on either in the app or on the website to select your own observations. So if you don't want your house to be pinned on a map, you can select the geoprivacy to be obscured, which means, again, it puts a random buffer within a box as to how that point is displayed on iNaturalist for others to see.
So that might answer, there was a question, how do you deal with sensitive species like owls? This individual normally waits 2 or 3 months to post. So
yeah, exactly. So depending on, so there's a page within the help section of iNaturalist called geoprivacy. That explains a little bit more about how the decision is made as to which species are obscured automatically, which gives you a link to the list of which ones are. If those ones aren't covered already and you want to obscure, you can choose to manually obscure that observation at the time of making it.
And it will count if it's verified, even though it's obscured?
Yes, yeah, it will still count. If it's kind of, the obscuring kind of falls halfway outside of the city boundary, it may not count towards that city is the only thing, because the obscuring buffer is done such a way that if you make a really small place and your point is within that, the obscuring is kind of obsolete, right? If you'd still be able to pinpoint exactly where that is. So the entire boundary of that observation has to be within the city boundary for it to count within that for the City Nature Challenge.
Right. So how do you participate if you're not living within a city or boundary of a project?
Yeah, so in general, as I mentioned, you can still contribute to iNaturalist. I was showing that observation or that map of observations of species at risk across the country that were taken during the City Nature Challenge. So you can still participate to iNaturalist and add observations that way. If you're close to a city and you can't get yourself there, that's great. But I'm sure most people aren't going to just move across the country or drive across to the next city over to take part. But then there's also identification that's needed to help identify observations in the City Nature Challenge. Actually, maybe that might be a good segue then for me to get into the next section, which is all about identifying and how to contribute if you're not in a city. Just for the interest of time, maybe I'll jump into that actually.
Yeah, great. And I'll keep tracking the questions.
Great, thanks. So you got my screen back up here, right? So as I was mentioning, we've partnered with working with Leave No Trace. Some couple things to bear in mind as we're going out to explore responsibly is plan ahead. This includes for our four-legged friends as well. There's some areas maybe where dogs it's not accessible to dogs in some natural areas. Bear in mind what's under your feet as you're walking. Stay on trails as much as possible. I know to get certain observations, we may have to venture a little bit. If you are, just bear in mind, if one person goes off trail to go check something out, that's probably not going to be a huge impact. But if hundreds of people are doing it, that will be. You're going to be creating new trails, and harming that area. So if you have to go off trails, be aware of where you're stepping. Step on durable surfaces, rocks and bare surfaces already to minimize any impact and be very aware of what's around you. Pack it in, pack it out. I think that's one of the main principles that a lot of people know, but that also goes to things that we're bringing in as food scraps. If it didn't grow there, so orange peels or apple peels, then it doesn't belong as well. Leave what you find. It's obvious we don't want people picking vegetation, but also it does include dead wood and bark and rocks. That is habitat for some species. So we want to maintain that area basically as good or better than how we found it. So basically what we're taking is photos only and leaving everything else behind. Taking photos is exactly why we're taking part in the City Nature Challenge. With wildlife, as I mentioned, it's good to get close for that photo, but within reason. We definitely don't want to disturb the wildlife, and using a zoom or binoculars can ensure that safety for both you and the wildlife itself. And as well, bear in mind for other visitors, but also the wildlife, as you get too close, you might scare it off. Allow other people to have a look as well. And noise is a factor as well, right? The quieter you are, the more likely you're not going to scare off any wildlife. And you'll get a better experience and photos to show for it as well. Okay, so now moving into how people can help if they're not in a participating city. As I mentioned, you can add observations to iNaturalist all year round and wherever you are, but we also need help identifying observations. We've created a kind of suite of some resources, both for taking photos, so these are valuable for that, but also for identifying species. We've created some resources that can be found again in the help section of iNaturalist.ca. That kind of it's not a complete species guide to all butterflies, for example, but it gives you the key features that are needed to look at, to identify, or to what to capture for your photo. So as soon as the first observation is made in iNaturalist, we can use help identifying those observations. Even if you're not a species expert, even if you don't know a lot of wildlife species, even triaging into groups like birds or butterflies is very helpful, because when experts go through to identify things, when specialists go, they're going to triage and they're going to want to look at just butterflies. So if someone can already have labeled it as a butterfly, it'll at least show up in their search, so they can better hone in what they're identifying as well. And even if you only know one species really well, if you know chickadees, you can go through and identify every single chickadee that was observed in the City Nature Challenge as well. So how to do this, there's an entire webinar that's dedicated to using the identification page on iNaturalist. But in short, if we can get to the project on iNaturalist, which was, if you go to the top bar that appears, if you go to iNaturalist.ca, you click on community, you'll see projects. It'll take you to the landing page for the projects page in general. And within that, you'll see the City Nature Challenge project. It's one of the featured ones at the top, which basically is a project is what's tallying and adding all of our observations across the country. You can then click through to each individual city if you want, or you can go through to just the general, stay within the general one. We have no observations there yet because it hasn't started, but once there is the first observations made, and you click on observations here, you'll see these options, one of which here will say identify. If you click on that, it takes you to an identification page that will be just filtered to only observations within the City Nature Challenge project. We can also, from there, if I don't know moths, so maybe I don't want to try and identify moths, if you click on the filters, you'll see options, and you can click by category. So if you know birds, or if you think you can triage birds a little bit better, you can click on birds and just look at those observations. Another good one to start with here is the unknowns. So these are things that people haven't added any name to yet at all. So if you click on that and click update within your search, this brings you to a list of all the unknowns that people have added to iNaturalist. Right off the bat, we can see most of these are, these are plants at least, birds, insects. So at a minimum, someone can go through and identify these as plants or birds. As an example, on this right one, this is obviously a bird through a screen. It just didn't get labeled as such. You can click on that. It brings up a little card. When you click on the add identification, add ID, it'll also bring up the image recognition software that you can use to help identify it. This one is very wrong, so I wouldn't blindly use this. This is a good example of why you should not just blindly use the image identification software. But you can classify to birds, so then when a specialist comes through and is looking at birds, they'll get this one in their feed. Okay, so I can take a few more questions in a minute, so I'm just kind of wrapping up. So what do we do next? What's happening from now on? So the City Nature Challenge starts on April 28th, 12 a.m., wherever your local time is. It's set to the local time of where you're located. So set your alarms 12 a.m. on the 28th. So we know when it starts. The next thing is to find out if your city is participating. Like I said, at citynaturechallenge.ca. Has a list of, or a map of all participating cities. Also that iNaturalist project, as I mentioned, if you go into projects in iNaturalist.ca, you'll be able to find the City Nature Challenge project that's going to be featured at the top. That also has the same map of all the participating cities. And in the meantime, you can get some practice in. You can upload some old photos to iNaturalist. Probably don't look like these old photos in this image, more likely things you have saved on your computer from past outings, or still on your phone or camera to get off. So So you can try it out, add some observations, figure it out ahead of time so you're all ready to go when City Nature Challenge starts on the 28th. And you can try out the identification page, get some practice in identifying, just kind of feel out how that page works. We got a couple of weeks to test that out in the meantime. In the meantime, we can also kind of explore nearby iNaturalist observations. So if you go to the explore page on iNaturalist.ca or within the app and check see nearby, you'll be able to get an idea of what's already being observed to know what you might be able to be on the lookout for. You can also use the filters within the explore page to set it to this time of year last year. So maybe during the month of April or end of April into May to find out what was most commonly observed at this time period last year to kind of know what's going to be coming in a couple of weeks, in a few weeks, to help contribute to the City Nature Challenge this coming year. It's also a good way to kind of find out where people are going to explore, where they're headed in your city, in your area. If you zoom in on some of those iNaturalist observations, you might see some patterns of walking trails, of shoreline areas that are publicly accessible that you could then also go and make use of during the iNaturalist, during the City Nature Challenge, to be able to contribute as well, to find some spots to go and observe and record observations. So with that, I'm going to put up the map again so people can have a look at while we're answering questions as to which cities are participating. And if there are other questions, which I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat throughout, but Dave has been graciously combining and looking through those questions, so I can have a look if there are any other ones.
Yeah, there's still a couple about next year, and how do you create a location, or do you need to associate yourself with a city or town to participate? So I would think the answer is yes.
Yeah, oh, sorry, I was kind of a little bit distracted with one of the questions as well. Can you repeat that a little bit, Dave?
Yeah, just about next year, people are asking, how do you participate in next year? Do you need to find a city or town to partner with?
Yeah, so the ship has sailed for this year. Like, all the cities are set, so which is great. We have 43, but yes, for next year, if you're interested, you can connect with us through the citynaturechallenge.ca website. Has some contact info there. There's also citynaturechallenge.org. That's being run by the California Academy of Sciences and the Los Angeles Natural History Museum, which originated and governs the entire global initiative. They also have a sign-up sheet. So you would have to sign up through the citynaturechallenge.org. And there's a list already, a sheet right there already, if you're interested in leading a city, or look to the existing cities that are already leading to help get involved with them, as opposed to duplicating efforts. Obviously, any organizers that are kind of both in the same city, the citynaturechallenge.org folks will kind of pair you up so that we can all put the efforts together as well.
Yeah, and from our end, if you send us your contact information and weren't an organizer this year, we send out our first meeting invite in late August or early September, so you could join us as we grow CNC 2024 and include more cities. So a couple more questions. How can iNaturalist be involved in phasing out pesticide issues with Health Canada management? That's a tough one, I would think.
Yeah, that's not really. So iNaturalist can provide a lot of data, of information on species occurrences, location, potentially insect abundance. It's not a entity that would be used to kind of lobby or kind of take stances on things. It's entirely a grassroots kind of community science led initiative. So it can provide a lot of information and data to decision makers to then use that in their work on pesticides. But in and of itself, iNaturalist isn't really going to be taking a position on that. But yeah, it definitely can help inform. For example, it definitely, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is using iNaturalist to keep track of early detection for invasive species, So other organizations can use that for data on insect and abundances in that sense.
A couple more pointed questions. Like for a city like Toronto, with most of the green space is parks, is there a list of spaces that are considered acceptable? How do you overcome the cultivated nature of city parks to actually participate?
Yeah, and that's a good one. I mean, the more you look, I find with some of those areas, the more you find. So there's still, it is, you know, there are a lot of parks that are manicured, but as I mentioned, you know, lichens on the trees that are there, some of the unmowed areas, there are birds that pass through. So there's still, you know, wildlife and native or wild species to record through those areas. So yeah, it's just a matter of kind of being able to find those. There's also kind of, as with you know, with Google Maps, if there's area you can find that are kind of maybe a bit more on the outskirts of the city that have a little more of the natural areas. Toronto, the Rouge Urban Natural Park is a great national park, is a great resource or a great spot to go explore. So kind of look at your options around that as well.
Where can they get the link to this recording at the end?
Awesome, that's perfect. I actually just dropped it in the chat. That will take you to all of the webinars that CWF has done on iNaturalist specifically in the past, but also if you're listening to this, you've registered, meaning that you will get an automatic email afterwards, probably middle of next week, with a link to the recording itself as well. So if you have friends or others you know of that didn't catch this, you'll be able to get that link and you can forward that on to them as well.
Okay, and just for clarity again, if you don't live in a participating city, for your observations to count to CNC Canada, can they just submit observations to that umbrella project, or should they just join a city?
No, so it's the projects are set up so that you have to be physically taking an observation within one of these boundaries that you see on the map here. If you're outside of that, you can't force an observation into it. So even joining a project won't automatically add your observation. It has to really be in that city. So the couple options. One is just adding it to iNaturalist in general. We can actually then kind of go back through and look at all the observations and kind of parse those out as to which ones were observed in iNaturalist, not as part of the City Nature Challenge, and kind of we can put together a little kind of snapshot of that. But also the citynaturechallenge.org people have, so the coordinators globally have created a project, and I don't have a link to it off the top of my head, but it is a project for non-city participants globally in the City Nature Challenge. So if people want to join something that is kind of affiliated with the City Nature Challenge, there is a link, or there is a project in iNaturalist that you can join, and it's only for people who have joined, and that would add your observations to this, what's called the collection project, but not a boundaries based one. It would be only just people who joined that. So you would be able to kind of contribute that way.
Would they find that on iNaturalist.ca or iNaturalist.org?
The project will be on both. Any projects or any initiatives that are created on iNaturalist.ca is also on iNaturalist.org. Like the websites are interchangeable in a sense. We don't have it featured on iNaturalist.ca, but I can do that after this. So if you check the projects page in the next week or so, or next few days, if you go to iNaturalist.ca and then do that projects link under community, like I showed to get to the City Nature Challenge Canada project, I'll put the global one up there as well to feature that people can join if you're not in a participating city.
We've got the link to recording. Where can they get a copy of the presentation?
Good question. We don't typically put that out, but I can look into that. We might be able to create just at least a PDF version of it that you'd see just the slides that I can share around for presentation. So along with the recording, I'll see if we can send the presentations out as well.
Yeah, you can just email James or myself and we'll try and get that to you. Down in the chat, it says the link Can't be copied. So that makes it hard to use the link. You see?
That's the link to the recording page, eh?
I managed to copy.
Yeah, me too. So I'm not sure if it's perhaps because mine's clickable as well and copyable. So I'm not sure why that's not showing. Oh, I don't know if it's from the, if you're looking at the presentation on the screen, you won't be able to copy, but if you open the chat, maybe that's, oh no, I guess it was written in the chat. So that's where you would have seen it.
It doesn't matter if you are a very small city count. I'm assuming that's for next year. No, we want every city involved.
Yeah, totally. A lot of places that are like either smaller cities or kind of municipalities you can do kind of the greater something area, for example, like as you see on the map, kind of right smack in the middle, that's Thunder Bay in the middle of Ontario. That's much larger than the city of Thunder Bay. It's kind of the greater kind of the I don't know what they're using official municipal boundaries, but it's the kind of county as opposed to the city of Thunder Bay. So that's definitely a way to do it as well. So the word city is used kind of loosely in that sense.
Just putting my email in the chat. For those people that want to participate next year and aren't currently listed, I will include them in the invite in September.
Excellent.
I don't see any more questions. Let me see.
I'm just dropping in the chat as well the link to the resources page that has a leave no trace PDF I was talking about, as well as some other things on iNaturalist, like those how to identify certain species groups as well. So that's so it looks like you have to click the link, which will open your browser, and from there you can copy it or save that, bookmark that page. Seems like that seems to work. Thanks for the solutions to everyone who's chiming in on the chat.
So I've got the link on both sides in the Q&A and the chat now. Hopefully that works.
Great.
I don't think I missed any. I'm just going to scroll through the questions again here. I don't see any. I do want to reiterate that we truly appreciate everyone for helping us bring this CNC Canada initiative together. You obviously don't have to participate, but we have been doing some national media, and the greater the number of cities involved, the more interesting it is to national media. As we continue to grow participation and include more cities, it becomes a big story, a bigger story. And certainly with the importance of and the focus on biodiversity in 2023, going forward next year, the more cities we can have involved, the better.
Yeah, I would agree. And yeah, and for everybody, the recording that will be available is anybody can share that link with others that may not have been able to be here, so we can hopefully increase that message to get more people, well, for one, participating this year, but also thinking about ahead to next year as well. So we can this is definitely free to share. We're also looking to do a French webinar as well that will be in 2 weeks. We're likely looking at I think Tuesday the 25th. So kind of that last week leading up into the City Nature Challenge. So for any of you that are bilingual or French speakers that would like to listen in as well, we're going to be delivering a French one as well.
And to help grow it next year, I know I live in St. Catharines, and we got St. Catharines and Niagara Falls involved. They have issued a challenge, much like San Francisco and Los Angeles did in the very beginning. It just helps amplify interest in the local community, spurring that kind of competitive nature between cities. So as you execute your own event this year, think of a city close by that organizers might be able to challenge to get involved and really, kind of encourage that competitive spirit within Canadian cities so we can grow our overall totals.
And as a wrap up, there was a last question coming in as to how much work it takes to organize. I think it can be as big or as small as any lead organizer wants to do. Some people are creating, community events like BioBlitzes. Others are just putting the message out there and basically just encouraging everyone to get out and explore. So it requires kind of attending a couple of meetings with the citynaturechallenge.org folks, but aside from that, can kind of be as big or as small as you want to make it. And of course, it requires a bit of knowledge on iNaturalist and creating an iNaturalist project, but folks can help you out with that as well. And we're a few minutes over, so I'd like to thank everybody for your time and listening in. And by all means, when the recording comes around, feel free to share this around. And we look forward to everybody participating and see what we can get for numbers this year. I think it's going to be a great event.
Thanks, everybody.